when we started doing some of the engagement assessment to go along with that.
Okay, so that you would do like a workshop, an ITC workshop with the whole team. Is that right?
Yeah, it would be like a mini version. It would be,
okay.
We'd explain it. Everybody built a map. We do map building. So in order to facilitate that, so it's not a 4-hour exercise, it's a 2-hour. So people would identify a behavior-based improvement goal. And actually, we'd have them come with column 1 and column 2 relatively filled out. So we could get to 3 and 4 in the aggregate. And just like we did during our cohort, get people to offer up their map and then share what we learned collectively around our own individual and how this impacts the team. And so there was team map building probably for the next 4 to 6 months. Wow. It wasn't as deep in the art because there was one of me. I wish I had another of me because I ended up touching virtually everybody at the company.
Interesting. Yeah. That's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, but it was great. Then they started seeing couple things. They started to see initially some of their out, like people started people weren't leaving as rapidly. People were having more rigorous conversations. People were able to start identifying if they were triggered. That was another language modeling we use. When we're triggered, we're on our big assumption. We go below the line, which was another model we used. And we go into like a belief, which is when we first started using below the line, it was an acknowledgement of an outcome. No, it's just a belief about what we think is going to happen with the outcome. It's that part of our neuroscience, neuro activity that predicts an outcome. So we just use language like, who's triggered today and why? We would start team meetings with who's triggered by their big assumption today. And this was the pivotal thing and why. Not just who's triggered, because then you point to the facts of why I should be triggered and why. Well, I have a belief if I call this client back or I have this conversation with a fellow engineer, I'm going to get, you see how the big assumption, well, how can we help Andy or Mike or someone else reframe that experience and as a collective, as a team? So it really increased transparency in this interpersonal dynamic conversation within the teams.
So at some point in this process, you began to talk with them about like how they hire and onboard people?
Absolutely. Because the demand for engineers, probably everywhere, but certainly in Seattle is pretty significant. To some degree, if someone had experience and had their stamp, engineering stamp, they would hire them, and they presented pretty well. So we talked just about what are the questions that you would like to know. Again, it goes to this probing, having difficult conversations, like really getting under the hood around, is this the right person? Is this the right person for our culture? Because they have a very deliberate culture. We haven't talked a bunch about that around what they call radical transparency with each other and clarity in communications, which was actually, they hadn't been living it. And when we started doing this work, they were living it more and more, but it wasn't included in their recruiting process. And so they get hires that they'd have, they'd onboard them, and then they would lag and they wouldn't perform. And so we did I wouldn't say it as an audit, but we looked at how they brought in candidates for their open engineering positions and the kind of questions that to make sure that they were asking to make sure there was a cultural fit. And at that point, they hired a head of HR. That fell into more or less her bailiwick, but we started including ITC. What's a behavior that you've struggled with in the past that would want to share with this team as you come to knowing that's going to probably present itself. But you want to know, and you want to develop an understanding of the hire's capacity for self-observation, even early on. So absolutely became part of their recruiting. And then in the onboarding, anybody that was onboarded, we would be exposed to ITC. We would do like a real brief overview of ITC, and they could opt in at any point based on their interest, their availability. And I would say there's about an 80% opt-in rate. And some people went through the entire arc. And some people would get through their first test, and people are kind of all over the place. I think at the end, there was over 100 employees. And what I learned is, given the scope of my work, I probably needed some help. And I would talk to the founders about that a lot, is that if we want to really do a deep developmental push inside the organization, then I would probably need to bring someone else in. And that's when COVID hit. So that changed some of the dynamic, just because we were managing work from home, and remote employees, and still trying to build a developmental culture, remotely. So that, I think that had that not occurred, we could have probably added to this, support staff for the coaching process. Well, I observed early on how they terminated people, which was all clandestine black ops. I mean, this person literally didn't see it coming. So getting people to own part of their own developmental piece of behavior change and mindset change. So people that they would put on performance improvement plans, over time it was, you have a mindset became such a part of the vernacular, the culture, that is creating these skill related issues. And so they really included mindset in terms of, what are your beliefs around asking for help, or getting too far out over your skis and not asking for help, or around having a challenging conversation. Come to that as part of how you're taking ownership for some behavior and some related changes in your job. So that became sort of, I don't know what the right word for it would be, but it just became part of the dynamic. It wasn't like an explicit, we're going to bring ITC into like how we terminate, or how do we build performance improvement plans. But the principals who ran termination, they, for the first time, began to see, like, someone has a belief around something that's impacting their work contribution. It's not that they're a bad engineer. It's like, let's wonder what's going on. How can we find out what's going on with this person? How can we run a test, in terms of behavior change? So it certainly had some impact, because, retention was such a key factor for them. And I guess in summary, they got to keep the people they wanted to, the really high valuable, high asset. And for a long time, they would let people just stay on. Fear of conversation, fear of conflict. I don't want to terminate Rick. He's been here forever. Well, maybe Rick needs to go, but let's do it in a way that Rick understands, and that's, stems from our sort of collective values.
Yeah. And so if you were doing the ITC workshop with a small team or something like that, then in the follow-up work, was that one-to-one, or did you find ways to maybe spread yourself a little thinner to help more people go through the process?
Great question. So what I did is I peered them up. So I would get two people, depending on the hiring cadence, or if there was a junior or senior, or someone, had a particular relationship, capital with someone on their team, and they had some exposure to ITC. I'd say, I want to peer you up over the next peer-to-peer for the next 4 weeks. I will sit in. So I did like a lot of 1 to 2. We build maps. They would build tests together. They would actually run tests together. It was primarily around team interaction with each other, or cross-discipline team. So like the lighting group is a subset of the electrical department. So I teamed some lighting designers together around, they have probably some mindset issue that we're not quite electrical engineers. So we're not as qualified. We're not have an engineering stamp. So they wanted to be able to have hard conversations, or more clear conversations, with the electrical team that runs them, basically. So I'd pair them up together, with test building. So I found that helped me scale, and actually it helped uncouple me from the learning. The interesting part, as I realized, is they could start building their own continuums if they just did, run a test, what did the two of you learn together? How can you support yourself, in your next, interaction based on what you just learned around what you thought, what you felt about this thing, and behaviorally what you would want to do differently. And it was really fun because then I'd see them kind of run off and do some probably inelegantly, but they were doing it because they were getting some results, which was great.